He divorced his quiet wife. Then the Mafia King's Superyacht arrived to bring her home. He slid the divorce papers across the marble table like they were nothing, like 8 years of her life meant nothing. Adrian Vossler didn't even look up from his phone when he said it. Sign and be gone by morning. No argument, no anger, just that flat corporate coldness he used on failed employees. Elena Marlowe stared at the papers, at the pen he'd set beside them, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not grief, not rage, but something older and quieter. Something final. She signed. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She walked out of his mansion with one suitcase and left behind 8 years of silence, sacrifice, and a love he never once tried to understand. That same night, a black superyacht cut through the harbor like a blade through dark water. Armed guards lined the dock. And when the man at the helm stepped onto shore, tall, silver-haired, with eyes the color of a winter sea, every security camera in a 3-block radius went dark simultaneously. His name was Cassian Ravel, and his first words, spoken loud enough for Adrian's head of security to hear clearly, were these: "Bring my daughter home, Shan." If this story already has your heart pounding, you're not alone. And we're only just beginning. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us the city or country where you're watching right now. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, because nothing about Elena Marlowe was ever what it seemed. Part 1. The morning Adrian handed her the divorce papers, Elena had been awake since 4. Not because she sensed what was coming, though later she would tell herself she should have. She'd been awake because the quarterly projections for Vossler Industries had been wrong for 3 consecutive months, and no one on Adrian's finance team seemed to notice. She'd noticed. She'd been quietly running numbers at the kitchen island, in the dark, with a cup of tea gone cold beside her laptop, because that was what Elena did. She noticed things. She fixed things. She did it without being asked, without being thanked, and without expecting either. That was the first problem. It had always been the first problem. Adrian came downstairs at 7:15 in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He poured himself coffee, stood with his back to her for a moment, and then set an envelope on the counter beside her laptop without a word. She looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" "I think you know." She opened it slowly. Her hands were steady. She would remember that later, how steady her hands were, even as her eyes moved down the first page and understood exactly what she was reading. "Adrian, the house is yours until the end of the month. My attorneys will handle the asset division. You'll be well taken care of." He said it the way he said everything, efficiently, like a memo being dispatched. "This isn't personal." Elena set the papers down. She looked at him the way she had looked at him 1,000 times before, with patience, with that particular stillness that people always misread as passivity. "You're doing this now." "I've been thinking about it for a while. While your company is hemorrhaging money." Something moved across his face. Not guilt. Irritation. "The company is fine." "The company is not fine." She turned the laptop toward him and showed him the numbers she'd been running since 4 in the morning. 3 divisions are reporting duplicate vendor contracts. Someone is running a shell account through your Luxembourg subsidiary. You have a leak, Adrian. Adrian. A serious one. And whoever is responsible has been doing it for at least 18 months. He looked at the screen, then at her. And in his eyes, she saw the thing that had always been there. The thing she had spent 8 years trying to soften. That particular brand of arrogance that can't accept intelligence from a source it's already dismissed. "Thank you for your concern," he said. "Sign the papers." She almost told him then. She almost laid everything out on that marble counter. All of it. Every piece she'd uncovered in the past 6 weeks. Every thread she'd pulled and every name she'd found at the end of those threads. She could have. She had the documents. She had the proof. But she looked at him standing there in his expensive suit with his cold coffee and his signed papers already waiting for her signature, and she understood something she hadn't fully understood until that moment. He would not believe her. Worse than that, he would hand her discovery directly to the man who was orchestrating it, because that man was the one Adrian trusted, the one Adrian called every morning, the one who had spent the last 4 years becoming indispensable. She picked up the pen. She signed. "Be out by morning," Adrian said. Then he took his coffee and walked away. Elena sat at that counter for a long time after she heard his footsteps disappear up the stairs. She didn't cry. Crying would have required a kind of grief she didn't have access to right then, because grief needs surprise, and she had not been surprised in a very long time. What she felt instead was something more like the closing of a door. Deliberate, quiet, final. She closed the laptop. She went upstairs. She packed one suitcase, took the documents she needed from the false bottom of the closet shelf that Adrian had never noticed in 8 years, and she called a number she hadn't dialed in half a decade. It rang twice. "I'm ready to come home," she said. There was a pause on the other end. Then, in a voice that was deep and unhurried and carried the weight of someone who had learned to measure every word, "I'll send the car." She was on a plane within 3 hours. What Elena Marlowe had never told Adrian, what she had never told anyone in the life she'd built beside him, was the name she'd been born into. She was not the daughter of a schoolteacher from Connecticut, as the carefully constructed biography suggested. She was not the quiet woman who'd grown up in a mid-sized house, in a mid-sized town, with unremarkable parents and an unremarkable past. That woman had existed on paper only, built piece by piece over 4 years before Elena walked into a gallery opening in Boston where Adrian Vossler had been standing near a painting he didn't understand, holding a glass of wine he didn't really want. Her real name, the name written in certain files in certain offices in Zurich, Monaco, and Singapore, was Elena Ravel, Cassian Ravel's only daughter. The Ravel name did not appear in newspapers. It did not appear on charity boards or Forbes lists or in any database that ordinary people could access. It appeared in quieter places, in the margins of international shipping records, in the private correspondence of 3 sitting heads of state, in the memory of every major organized crime family in Europe who had, at one point or another, sat across a table from Cassian and negotiated the terms of their continued existence. Cassian was not a violent man by preference. He was a precise man. He built systems. He understood leverage the way a surgeon understands anatomy, not as a blunt instrument but as a map of pressure points. And he had spent 40 years becoming the most complete cartographer of power that the underground world had ever produced. Elena had learned at his knee. By the time she was 19, she could read a financial balance sheet for concealed fraud the way other people read a recipe. By 22, she was running logistics for her father's legitimate shipping operations, legitimate being a relative term in the Ravel vocabulary, and had identified 3 infiltration attempts by rival organizations before any of Cassian's senior advisors had even registered a problem. She had her father's precision and her mother's patience, and she had something neither of them had possessed in quite the same measure: the ability to be completely, utterly invisible. She could sit in a room and no one would remember she'd been there. She'd always considered that a liability. She had learned, over time, to consider it a weapon. The decision to leave, to build a false identity and disappear into the civilian world, had not been impulsive. Nothing Elena did was impulsive. It had been strategic, born of a threat she had identified and traced back to its source. And when she understood what that source meant, she had made the only calculation that made sense. There was a man named Gregor Fast. Fast was not a name known outside very specific circles, but inside those circles, it carried the specific gravity of someone who had made himself essential to 3 different powerful organizations simultaneously and owed true loyalty to none of them. He was an information broker of the highest order, not someone who sold secrets, but someone who created situations in which secrets became necessary currency. He had been circling Cassian Ravel's operation for years, looking for leverage, and at some point in Elena's 24th year, he had identified her as the most efficient lever available: Cassian Ravel's daughter, his only child, his acknowledged successor. The plan, as Elena eventually reconstructed it through sources she had cultivated carefully over 18 months, had been to take her. Not kill her. That would have produced a response too catastrophic to survive. Take her, hold her, and use her existence as a means of forcing Cassian into a series of concessions that would, piece by piece, dismantle the architecture of his influence. Elena had done what she always did when she saw a problem approaching. She removed herself from the equation entirely. She had told her father. That conversation had been the hardest of her life. watching Cassian Ravel, a man who had never shown fear in her presence, sit very still across from her and absorb the news that his daughter intended to disappear. He had not argued. That was how she knew he understood the logic. Cassian always argued when he disagreed. His silence had been a form of grief she had tried not to look at directly. She had constructed the Elena Marlowe identity with the help of two people she trusted absolutely, and she had walked away from the Ravel world on a Tuesday afternoon in autumn, and she had not looked back. Not because she didn't love her father, because she loved him enough to become someone he couldn't find easily. She had not planned to fall in love with Adrian Vossler. That was the piece of the story that embarrassed her most, when she examined it honestly. She had walked into that gallery as Elena Marlowe for the first time, testing the identity in a low-stakes environment, and she had encountered a man who was trying very hard to look like he belonged somewhere he clearly didn't. There was something in that, in the effort, in the almost imperceptible tension of someone performing a version of themselves for an audience, that she recognized because she was doing exactly the same thing. They had talked about the painting neither of them understood for 45 minutes. He had been funny about it in a way she hadn't expected, dry, self-deprecating, aware of his own pretension in a way that suggested he was smarter than the pretension. She had laughed twice, genuinely, and that had surprised her enough that she'd agreed to coffee. She should have walked away from the coffee. She didn't. What followed was 2 years of learning a person the way you learn a language, gradually, imperfectly, with moments of surprising fluency and long stretches of misunderstanding. Adrian was brilliant in his way, strategic, focused, capable of a kind of single-minded drive that built things. He was also profoundly lonely in a way he could not name, raised by a father who had taught him that vulnerability was weakness and that success was the only metric that mattered. He carried that damage the way a lot of people carry damage, invisibly, until you were close enough to see its shadow. Elena had been close enough. She had made a decision that she could feel, even now, was irrational by her own standards. She had decided he was worth staying for, not worth saving. She had never been arrogant enough to think in those terms. Worth staying beside. She had also known, with the part of her mind that never fully turned off, that being Elena Vossler would provide her with a level of cover that even her father's people couldn't easily penetrate. A corporate wife in Boston, invisible, safe. What she had underestimated was how much it would cost her to maintain both things simultaneously, the marriage and the silence. How much of herself she would spend in that space between who she was and who she was pretending to be. 8 years was a long time to hold a breath. The car Cassian sent was not, in fact, a car. It was a helicopter that landed on the roof of a parking structure 2 miles from the Vossler mansion, and it took her to a private airfield where a plane was waiting with her father's second-in-command, a woman named Dara, standing on the tarmac with an expression that managed to convey both relief and professional restraint simultaneously. "He's been waiting," Dara said. "I know. Are you all right?" Elena looked at her for a moment. The question was genuine, and Dara was one of perhaps 4 people alive whose genuine question she answered honestly. "Not yet," she said. "I will be." The flight was 7 hours. She slept for 4 of them, which surprised her. She hadn't expected to be able to sleep. When she woke, Dara was across the aisle reading something, and outside the window the sky had gone the dark blue of very early morning, and Elena lay still for a moment and ran through everything she knew. She knew that Marcus Hale had been systematically defrauding Vossler Industries for at least 18 months, using a network of dummy vendors and a Luxembourg account that existed in the negative space between 2 separate auditing firms' jurisdictions. She knew that the fraud had not been random opportunism. It had been engineered specifically to weaken the company to a point where Adrian would become desperate enough to be manipulated. She knew that Marcus had been feeding information about Adrian's financial vulnerabilities to at least one external party for well over a year. What she didn't yet know, what she had been unable to determine before she left, was who Marcus Hale was working for, and that, she understood, was the piece of the puzzle that everything else depended on. She also knew something that she had not told anyone. Not Dara, not her father, not even herself fully, in the clearest possible language, because some truths require more courage to name than others. She knew that Marcus had been aware of her real identity for at least 6 months. She'd found the evidence buried in a file on the server she shouldn't have been able to access and wasn't supposed to know existed. A single document, encrypted, that she had cracked with tools she'd kept current out of old habit. Her photograph. Not Elena Marlowe's photograph, but a photograph from 14 years ago of a young woman with darker hair and a sharper expression than she typically wore now, her real name beneath it, and a notation in shorthand she had recognized because it was a notation system she had seen before, in a different context, a different decade. Gregor Fast's notation system. She had stared at that document for a long time in the blue light of the laptop screen in the small hours of a Tuesday morning. Then she had closed it, wiped her access trail, and gone back to running Adrian's quarterly numbers. She had needed 2 more weeks to be certain. She had used them. She was certain now. Whatever Marcus Hale was running inside Vossler Industries, it wasn't just corporate fraud. It wasn't even primarily about Adrian. It was about her. It was about drawing her out of cover. It was about creating a crisis severe enough that Elena Ravel would have to surface. And she had. She'd just surfaced on her own terms, through her own door, without giving anyone the timing they were counting on. She closed her eyes again and listened to the engines and let herself think about what came next. She thought about Adrian standing in his kitchen in his expensive suit, dismissing the numbers she'd shown him with that particular blankness that meant he was protecting himself from information he couldn't control. She thought about the 8 years that had preceded that moment, 8 years of being useful in ways that were never acknowledged, of building a version of safety around a man who didn't know he needed it and wouldn't have accepted it if he had. She thought about the look on his face when he'd said this isn't personal. The worst part wasn't the divorce. She could understand the divorce. She could follow the logic of a frightened man dismantling his life by degrees and mistaking that for control. The worst part was the word personal. The idea that anything between them had not been personal. The idea that she could be dismissed as a category rather than known as a person. That was the thing she had never learned how to absorb. Dara looked up from her reading. "We land in 40 minutes. "I know." Elena straightened in her seat and ran a hand through her hair and became deliberately the version of herself that her father would need her to be when she walked off that plane. Focused, present, operational. She could grieve later. She was always grieving later. That was the part she'd never found a way around. The wheels touched down as the first gray light of dawn was beginning to find the edges of the horizon, and through the oval window she could see the harbor, and in the harbor, lit from below by underwater lights that turned the water the color of deep jade, the superyacht sat motionless and enormous and patient. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she unfastened her seatbelt, stood up, and went to meet her father. The superyacht was called the Meridian, and it was not what Elena had expected. She had grown up around her father's various vessels. The functional ones used for shipping, the sleeker ones used for meetings that needed to happen outside any jurisdiction's reach. But the Meridian was something different. It was the kind of ship that communicated a message before anyone aboard said a word, that the person who owned it had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. 3 decks above the waterline, communications equipment that belonged on a military vessel, and a stillness about it, even moored, that felt less like calm and more like controlled power at rest. Cassian Ravel was waiting on the main deck. He looked older than she remembered. That was the first thing that hit her, and it hit her harder than she'd braced for. The silver had moved further into his hair, and there were new lines around his eyes, and he was standing with his hands clasped behind his back, in the posture she knew meant he was working very hard to appear composed. He watched her come up the gangway without moving, without speaking, and when she reached him and stopped 2 feet away, they looked at each other for a long moment with the specific awkwardness of people who love each other and have run out of practice showing it. Then he said, "You're thinner. You're older." A pause. Something moved across his face that might, in a different man, have been called a smile. "Come inside." The main salon was warm and lit low, and there was coffee already on the table. Real coffee, the kind she hadn't been able to get in Boston without special ordering it. A small and absurd detail that cracked something open in her chest because it meant he'd remembered. She sat down. He sat across from her. Dara positioned herself near the door without being asked, which was what Dara always did. Cassian poured the coffee himself, set the cup in front of her. Then he folded his hands on the table and looked at her with those winter-gray eyes that had never once, in her entire life, looked at her with anything other than complete and total attention. "Tell me everything," he said. She did. She started with Marcus Hale, the vendor contracts, the Luxembourg account, The 18-month timeline she'd reconstructed from fragments across 3 separate systems. She told him about the notation she'd recognized in the encrypted file. She told him about the photograph. She laid it out in sequence the way he'd taught her, chronologically, factually, without editorializing, letting the architecture of the information speak before offering interpretation. Cassian listened without interrupting. That was a thing about her father that she had never stopped being grateful for. He listened the way he did everything else, completely, without performing attention, actually present. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she watched him process it the way she'd watched him process problems her entire life. That slight stillness, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. Fast, he said finally. I can't confirm it's him directly, but the notation, I know the notation. His voice was flat. Fast used that system with 3 of his couriers. I haven't seen it appear in 6 years. He looked at her. Which means either he resurfaced or someone who worked with him is operating independently. Either scenario points back to the same objective. Flush you out. He said it without inflection, but she heard what was underneath it. She'd always been able to hear what was underneath it with him. They constructed a crisis around a man they knew you were close to, knowing you wouldn't be able to watch it happen without acting. I acted on my own timeline. You acted. He said it gently but precisely, in the way that meant he wasn't criticizing, just naming the fact. That's what matters to them. You surfaced. Elena wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I know. The silence between them was the kind that had history in it. Years of conversations like this one, of sitting across from each other and saying the hard things plainly, because neither of them had ever been able to tolerate the alternative. She had missed this, she realized. Not just him. This specific thing, the experience of being in a room with someone who did not require her to translate herself. How bad is the exposure, she asked. Manageable. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and set a slim folder on the table. Your Marlowe identity is still clean. Whoever has the photograph, they haven't moved it through any channel we monitor, yet. He paused on that word deliberately. But if Fast is involved, the window is narrow. He doesn't collect leverage, he deploys it. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 pages. Surveillance photographs, a financial trace, a partial organizational chart with several boxes empty. She studied them the way she studied everything, methodically, letting each piece find its relationship to the others before forming a conclusion. Who are these people? She pointed to 2 of the empty boxes. Unknown. Hale's contacts in the external organization. We're working on it. He paused. There's something else. She looked up. Adrian Vossler has been making inquiries. Cassian's voice carried no particular judgment. He'd learned over many years to present her with information about her personal life the way he presented everything else, as data, not commentary. He started the morning after you left. He's contacted 3 of your former colleagues from the Marlowe cover, your housekeeper, and a private investigator out of New York. Elena set the folder down carefully. He's looking for me. He's panicking. A pause. His company lost 2 board members yesterday. Both resigned simultaneously, citing undisclosed conflicts of interest. His stock dropped 11% before the market closed. She was quiet for a moment. She could see it unfolding, the sequence Marcus would be running now that she'd removed herself from Adrian's proximity. Without her there, absorbing information and quietly redirecting disasters before they landed, the machinery would start to show its damage. Marcus had been counting on that, had probably been counting on Adrian's public collapse as the second phase of whatever he was building. He's accelerating, she said. Yes. Because I left early. Yes. Cassian looked at her steadily. Whatever timeline Hale was operating on, your departure compressed it. He's moving faster than planned. He paused. That's not entirely bad news. People moving faster than planned make mistakes. They do. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the harbor was lightening now, the water going from jade to gray to the first thin silver of morning. A fishing boat was moving out toward open water, patient and small against the horizon. I need to go back, she said. Behind her, the silence had a different quality. She didn't turn around. She heard Cassian set his coffee cup down. She heard the specific quality of his breath, measured, controlled, the breath of a man deciding how to say something he knew she wasn't going to like. Elena, not to the marriage. That's done. She turned around then and looked at him directly. But Hale still has active access to Vossler Industries. Whatever he's building with Fast's people, it's still in motion, and the only way to dismantle it is from the inside. She paused. You know that. I know several things, Cassian said carefully. One of them is that you have been operational inside that environment for 8 years without support, and you are not as unmarked by it as you believe. The words landed precisely because they were true, and they both knew it. I'm fine. You signed the papers, he said. On the same morning, you had enough evidence to dismantle the fraud without leaving. You could have taken that information to any of 4 people I know of and handled it remotely. But you signed the papers and you called me and you got on a plane. He looked at her with the particular steadiness of someone who loves you enough to say the thing you don't want to hear. I'm not criticizing you. I'm observing that you needed to leave, and I want to understand whether going back is strategy or whether it's something else. Elena was quiet for a long moment. It's both, she said finally. He nodded slowly. Whatever he felt about that answer, he kept it behind his eyes. All right, he said, then we do it properly. You don't go back exposed, you go back with infrastructure. You need Dara. You need the financial surveillance package we've been running on Hale, and you need me on standby. He said it with a quiet finality that was not negotiation. Those are the terms. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was growing in the window behind her, and she could see in his face the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent 5 years not knowing exactly where his daughter was, and who was now being asked to send her back into proximity with the people who'd been trying to surface her. Okay, she said. He picked up his coffee. Good. A pause. Are you hungry? She almost laughed. Yes. Dara, he said, without raising his voice. Already ordered, Dara said from the door set. 3 days on the Meridian passed in a focused blur of preparation. Elena worked through the financial surveillance package Cashin's team had built on Marcus Hale. 14 months of transaction data, communication intercepts from 2 sources, and a property trace that revealed 3 assets held through a corporate shell that Marcus's declared income could not have supported. She built a timeline on paper, the way her father had taught her, because screens could be erased, and paper made you commit to what you actually knew versus what you were inferring. What she knew, Marcus had been diverting money for at least 18 months. What she knew, the diversion was structured to look like operational inefficiency rather than active theft. The kind of thing that would only show up in an audit designed to look for it specifically. What she knew, Marcus had a contact in the external organization who had authorized payments totaling, across the full period, approximately $4 million. $4 million into Marcus, which meant whatever Marcus was being paid to deliver was worth considerably more than $4 million to whoever was buying. What she inferred, the endgame was not the money. The money was operational funding. The endgame was access, specifically access to the Vossler Industries network of international contacts, which was, on the legitimate surface, a mid-level corporate shipping and logistics empire, but which overlapped, in ways Adrian had never known and Elena had always known, with the peripheral edges of Cassian Ravel's actual business infrastructure. Adrian's company had been, without his knowledge and for the entirety of their marriage, a partial blind for 3 of Cassian's legitimate facing operations. It had been that way before Elena arrived. Her father had built the connection carefully, years before she'd ever met Adrian. The irony was not lost on her. She had fallen in love with a man her father had already quietly incorporated into his architecture. She had never told Adrian. She had never told Cassian that she knew. Some pieces of information, she had learned early, were safest held by one person only. Now someone outside the system knew about the connection, and they were using Marcus Hale to exploit it. On the morning of the 3rd day, she was on the upper deck with a second cup of coffee and the property trace spread across the table, weights on the corners against the harbor wind, when Dara appeared at the deck door. "We have a problem," Dara said. Elena looked up. "Adrian Vossler is in the city." A silence. The wind moved across the papers. Elena put her hand on the property trace to stop it lifting. "How close?" "His plane landed 2 hours ago. He's at a hotel 4 kilometers from the harbor." Dara's voice was carefully neutral. "He has the private investigator with him, and A pause. He has photographs. Of what? Of the harbor. Of the Meridian. Dara met her eyes. Of you, coming off the gangway 3 nights ago. Elena was very still for a moment. Then she folded the property trace precisely along its existing creases and set it under the coffee cup. He moved faster than I thought. He's desperate. Desperate people are unpredictable. She stood up. Where's my father? Salon. He already knows. Cassian was standing when she came in. Not pacing. Cassian never paced, but standing at the window with his hands behind his back in the way that meant he was thinking hard and did not want to be interrupted. She didn't interrupt him. She poured herself more coffee and sat down and waited. After a moment, he turned around. He wants a meeting. She looked at him. He had his PI deliver a message to the doc, handwritten. Cassian held it out. She took it. The handwriting was Adrian's, so she would have known it anywhere. The angular, slightly compressed letters of someone who'd learned penmanship from a strict father and never fully relaxed it. It said, I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I'm asking anyway. 1 hour. I'll explain what I know and you can decide what to do with it. AV. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table. He found us fast, she said. He's motivated. Cassian sat down across from her. And whoever his PI is, they're competent. This was not luck. He looked at the note. The question is whether this is Adrian acting alone or whether someone pointed him here. The implication landed like a stone in still water. She felt the ripples move out from it. You think Marcus told him where I went? I think it's possible. If Hale knew about your father, which the photograph suggests he did, then pointing Adrian at the harbor costs Marcus nothing and potentially gives him something useful. Cassian's eyes were steady. A grieving ex-husband walking onto the ship creates chaos. Chaos is useful to people who are trying to move quickly. Elena turned the coffee cup in her hands, around and around. She was aware of doing it, aware that it was a tell, her version of pacing, and she stopped herself deliberately. Or, she said, Adrian figured it out himself. He saw the yacht in the harbor the night I left. He's not stupid, whatever else he is. He might have made the connection. That's also possible. In which case, he knows more than Marcus intended him to know, which makes him a liability to Marcus. Cassian's expression didn't change, but she saw something shift behind his eyes. Yes. They looked at each other across the table, and Elena understood what her father wasn't saying. That if Marcus Hale believed Adrian was becoming a liability, the situation Adrian was currently in was more dangerous than Adrian knew. She picked up the note again. 1 hour. She set it back down. Tell him 2 o'clock, she said. On the ship. My terms. Cassian was quiet for a moment. You're sure? No. She met his eyes. But the alternative is letting him wander around the city with a PI and photographs and incomplete information while Marcus Hale decides what to do about him. At least here, I control the environment. A long pause. Then Cassian reached across and took the note. All right, he said. 2 o'clock. Adrian arrived at 1:57. She watched him come up the gangway from the upper deck. Watched without revealing herself. The way she'd learned to observe people before engaging them. A habit so ingrained she didn't think about it anymore. He looked terrible. That was her first honest assessment, and she sat with it for a moment without trying to feel anything in particular about it. He hadn't slept. That much was visible in the set of his shoulders and the way he moved, slightly too carefully, the way people move when they've been running on stimulants and stubbornness for 72 hours. He was wearing the same suit jacket she'd seen him in 2 days before he handed her the papers, which meant he'd either packed carelessly or not gone home. His hair was wrong. He looked like a man whose life had come apart and who was only beginning to understand that he'd been holding the seam open himself. 2 of Cassian's people met him at the top of the gangway and escorted him to the main salon. She gave it 4 minutes. Then she went down. He was standing in the middle of the salon when she walked in. He turned around when he heard her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was a particular kind of silence that follows the ending of something, and it requires a moment before either party can push through it into whatever comes next. He looked at her face. She looked at his. You look terrible, she said. I know. His voice was rough. He hadn't been sleeping. Elena, sit down, Adrian. He sat. She sat across from him, the same seat she'd taken across from her father, which she recognized as probably meaningful in some way she didn't have time to examine. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at him directly. "Talk," she said. He talked. It came out not in the organized, sequential presentation she would have given, but in the way frightened people talk when they've been holding something too long, slightly out of order, circling back, the logic clear but the delivery fractured. He told her about the board members resigning. He told her about the investigation his own compliance team had quietly flagged, which he'd initially dismissed as a misunderstanding and which had turned out to be considerably more than that. He told her about going back to the numbers she'd shown him on the laptop the morning she left, and spending 6 hours with his CFO confirming what she'd already known. He told her that the Luxembourg account traced back, through 2 shell corporations, to a man named Marcus Hale. He stopped talking. The silence had a different quality now, not the silence of an ending, but the silence of someone waiting to be told how bad it actually was. Elena looked at him. She thought about 8 years. She thought about the kitchen counter, and the pen, and this isn't personal. "How much does Marcus know about your international contacts?" she asked. "Your shipping network. The contracts through the Rotterdam office." Something shifted in his face. "Why?" "Answer the question." "He has full access. He's had full access for 4 years. He manages the international account relationships. It's his primary—" He stopped. Something was happening behind his eyes, the specific movement of a very intelligent person arriving at a conclusion they didn't want to reach. "Elena, what is he actually after?" She studied him for a moment. Then she made a decision, not an emotional one, an operational one, the kind her father had taught her to make by asking a single question. What does the situation require? The situation required Adrian to understand enough to be useful and not enough to be dangerous. The situation also required, she was honest enough to admit, that she stop managing what he knew the way she'd been managing it for 8 years, because that approach had a demonstrated record of not working. "Marcus Hale isn't just stealing from you," she said. "He's been building a case, compiling your international network, your contacts, your shipping relationships. He's going to sell that information to an organization that will use it to apply pressure to people who don't want their business arrangements exposed." She paused. "And when those people feel that pressure, some of them will apply it to my father." Adrian stared at her. She watched him process it, watched the sequence move across his face. The confusion first, then the beginning of a larger understanding, then the thing she'd been watching for, the moment he understood what she'd been doing for 8 years in the margins of his life. The numbers at 4 in the morning. The vendor she'd suggested he drop 2 years ago, who'd turned out to have ties to a competitor's information network. The contract clause she'd quietly rewritten during what she'd told him was an afternoon of admin work. The moment he understood that his success had not been entirely his own, and that the person who'd supplemented it had been the person he'd handed a pen to and told to sign and be gone by morning. She watched it land. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he did speak, his voice was different, lower, stripped of the corporate fluency he used like armor. "How long have you known?" he said. "About Marcus." 6 weeks. "And you didn't tell me." "I told you the morning you gave me the divorce papers. You told me to sign." He closed his eyes, opened them. The fluorescent competence was completely gone now, and what was underneath it was a man who was genuinely reckoning with something, and she was careful not to mistake that for resolution, because reckoning and resolution were very different things, and she had been confused about that before. "I need to understand something," he said. "Your father, Cassian Ravel." He said the name carefully, like something that might break if mishandled. "Who is he?" "You already know the answer to that. I want to hear it from you." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the harbor sounds, water against the hull, a gull, the distant sound of a motor somewhere across the water. Small, ordinary sounds around the edges of a very unordinary conversation. "He's the most powerful man in an industry that doesn't have a publicly listed name," she said. "He's spent 40 years building infrastructure that legitimate businesses and governments use without knowing they're using it. He's my father. And he's the reason Marcus Hale's employers want access to your shipping network, because 3 of your Rotterdam contracts run parallel to my father's actual operations." She paused. "Whoever Marcus is working for, They're not after your money. They're using your company as a door, and they've been planning to walk through it for a very long time. Adrian was very still. Marcus knew about you, he said slowly, about who you actually are, for at least 6 months. He never said. He stopped, started again. He was the one who suggested we needed to restructure the executive team. 8 months ago, he specifically said. He stopped again, and this time he didn't start again because the sentence didn't need finishing. She could see him arriving at the end point on his own. He wanted you gone, Adrian said. He told me you were the reason I couldn't focus, that you were holding me back, that I needed to. His voice broke slightly on something. I thought it was his opinion. I thought. He was managing you, Elena said, flatly, not unkindly, but without cushion. He's been managing you for at least a year. Everything he told you about your marriage, about your company culture, about what was holding you back, he was shaping a narrative, getting you to dismantle the only obstacle he had. Adrian looked at her across the table. His face had gone through several things in the last few minutes and was currently somewhere in the territory of a person confronting the full dimensions of their own blindness for the first time. It was not a comfortable thing to witness. She had known, intellectually, that this moment would happen eventually, that the arithmetic of what Marcus had done would at some point become undeniable. But knowing it was coming hadn't made sitting across from it any easier. He used me, Adrian said. Yes. To get to you. To get to my father. I was the mechanism. He was quiet for a moment, then very quietly, and I handed him the tool. She didn't answer that. Some things didn't need answering. What she did not expect, what she had not prepared for, was what happened next. Adrian Vossler, a man who had been raised to treat vulnerability as a failing and who had spent 42 years becoming very expert at performing composure, put both hands flat on the table and looked at her with an expression that had nothing managed in it at all. I'm sorry, he said. Not I didn't know. Not I was manipulated. Just the 2 words, plain and unadorned, with the specific weight of something that had been held for a while before being set down. Elena felt something move through her that she had no immediate name for. She didn't reach for a name. She let it move through her and settle. I know, she said. Outside, the harbor sounds continued. Somewhere above them, she could hear Cassian moving, the specific weight of his footsteps, which she'd known her entire life. She heard him stop. She knew he was listening. What do we do now? Adrian asked. She looked at him. 8 years. 1 sentence across a kitchen counter. 1 suitcase. 3 days on her father's ship, reconstructing the architecture of a betrayal that had been running underneath their shared life the entire time. She looked at him, and she made a decision. We take Marcus apart, she said, from the inside, and we do it before his employers realize we're moving. She paused. But I need access to the Rotterdam files, the ones Marcus controls, and I need you to get me into that office without Marcus knowing I'm there. Adrian nodded slowly. He looked, she thought, like a man who had just been handed back a weight he'd thought he'd put down, but who understood this time that the weight was not a punishment, but a responsibility. When? He said. Tomorrow night, she said, before he makes his next move. She didn't tell him what she already knew, that Marcus Hale had made a call 40 minutes ago from a number registered to a shell company in Liechtenstein that Dara's intercept had flagged in real time. She didn't tell him that the call had lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds, or that the voice on the other end had spoken 2 sentences in a language that Dara had identified but not yet translated, or that when the call ended, Marcus had immediately booked a one-way flight out of the country for the following evening. Tomorrow night was not just a deadline she had chosen. Tomorrow night was the only window they had left. The Rotterdam files were not in Marcus Hale's office. That was the first thing Elena understood when she walked through the side entrance of Vossler Industries' executive floor at 11:43 the following night, Adrian's access card still warm in her hand from where he'd pressed it into her palm in the parking structure below. The office was dark except for the emergency lighting strips along the baseboards, and it smelled of recycled air and the particular staleness of a building that had been running on reduced staff for 72 hours, while its board hemorrhaged members and its stock continued its controlled descent. Dara was in the car downstairs. Cassian was on the Meridian with 2 of his people monitoring the intercept feed. Adrian was with her, which had not been the original plan but had become the plan when he'd pointed out, with a quiet precision she hadn't expected from him, that Marcus's filing system was organized according to a logic that only Adrian and Marcus shared, and that without the key to that logic, she could spend 4 hours in the wrong directories. He had been right. She had hated that he was right. His personal drive, Adrian said, low, moving ahead of her toward the corner office at the end of the hall. He keeps a partition on the local server that doesn't sync to the cloud backup. IT flagged it 18 months ago as an anomaly, and he told them it was a legacy system artifact. I should have. Don't, she said. He stopped. Don't do that right now. We can't afford it. He nodded once, tight, and kept moving. The corner office was unlocked. That was the second thing that put a cold thread through her. Not that it was unlocked, because Marcus had left in apparent haste, and people in haste forgot things, but the quality of the unlocked door. It was not the unlocked door of someone who forgot. It was the unlocked door of someone who no longer cared. She stopped in the doorway. Adrian moved past her toward the desk. She stood in the frame and looked at the room. Really looked at it, the way she'd been trained, letting her eyes move slow and systematic rather than jumping to the obvious points. The desk. The filing cabinets. The bookshelf along the left wall. The credenza under the window. The chair. The chair had been moved. It was a small thing. The chair was a standard executive desk chair, black, and it had left marks in the carpet from years of use. 4 small impressions where the caster sat when it was in its default position. The chair was currently 18 inches to the right of those impressions. Someone had sat in that chair recently and rolled it to the right to access something. Adrian, she said quietly, don't touch the computer yet. He turned from the desk, looked at her. She walked to the credenza. It was a heavy piece, dark wood, 4 drawers, a cabinet section on the right side with 2 doors. She crouched and looked at the bottom edge where it met the carpet. The carpet fibers along the left side were bent inward, slightly, in the direction you'd expect if the credenza had been recently pulled a few inches from the wall. She stood and gripped the left side of the credenza and pulled. It moved on the 3rd try. Heavier than expected, but it moved. Behind it, flush with the baseboard, was a wall panel that had been painted to match the surrounding surface so precisely that you would not see it unless you were looking for a seam. The seam was there. A rectangle approximately 14 inches wide and 10 inches tall, with a magnetic latch that released when she pressed the upper right corner. Instead, a shelf. On the shelf, a laptop, a portable hard drive, and a manila envelope sealed with tape. Adrian made a sound behind her. She didn't turn around. She pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves from her jacket pocket. She had come prepared for several possibilities. And she lifted the laptop first, opened it. The screen came alive immediately, no password prompt, which told her it had been in sleep mode recently. The desktop had 3 folders. Their names were not words. They were sequences, 17A, 17B, and 17C. She opened 17A. The folder contained financial records, not the vendor fraud, not the Luxembourg account, but a different layer entirely. Transactions she hadn't seen in her 6 weeks of reconstruction. Payments not from an external organization to Marcus, but from Marcus outward to 7 different recipients across 4 countries, in amounts that ranged from $15,000 to $200,000 each, spread across a period of 3 years. 3 years. Not 18 months. 3 years. She felt the cold thread become a cold current, moving through her steadily. She had been wrong about the timeline. She had built her reconstruction on the assumption that the fraud began 18 months ago, because that was when the first anomalies appeared in the records she'd accessed. But 18 months was when it became visible. The architecture had been in place for 3 years, which meant Marcus had started building this before she'd found the encrypted file, before the photograph, before any of the events she'd been treating as the beginning. She opened 17B. Communication logs. Encrypted, but the encryption was a format she recognized, an older commercial system, the kind that had been widely used 6 or 7 years ago and had since been largely replaced. She could crack it, but not here, not on this machine without her tools. She pulled out her phone and photographed every screen, methodically, every file name, every visible timestamp, every fragment of metadata. She opened 17C. The first document in the folder was a photograph. She stared at it for several seconds without moving. It was a photograph of the Meridian. Not from the harbor, from 3 days ago when Adrian's PI had taken surveillance shots. This photograph was different, older, the resolution slightly lower, the angle from the water looking up at the deck. And on the deck, visible clearly because whoever took the photograph had used a long lens and the light had been good, were two people, Cashin Ravel and Elena. The timestamp in the corner of the image read 4 years and 3 months ago. Elena. Adrian's voice was careful, the way voices get when someone is watching another person have a realization they don't fully understand yet. She didn't answer. She was looking at the photograph, at the timestamp, at the specific implication of that timestamp, which was this. Someone had taken this photograph 4 years and 3 months ago, which was 6 months into her marriage to Adrian, which was well before Marcus Hale had joined Vossler Industries as a senior advisor. Marcus had been placed, not hired, not recruited through the standard channels that his personnel file described. Placed, deliberately, into Adrian's organization. The fraud, the manipulation, the engineered divorce. None of it was opportunism. It was a program, a long, patient, multi-year program, and it had been running since before Elena had any reason to suspect it, which meant someone had known where she was from almost the beginning. She set the laptop down and picked up the manila envelope, opened it. Inside were 2 documents and a smaller envelope. The first document was a contract, in German, which she read, a consulting agreement between a company called Veritex Solutions and an individual identified only by an alphanumeric code. The contract was dated 3 years and 8 months ago. The second document was a partial translation of something that appeared to be internal communications from an organization she didn't recognize by name, but recognized by structure. The structure of how the sentences were constructed, the way information was compartmentalized in the text, the specific language used to describe operational security. She had seen writing structured that way once before, in documents that had been produced by a man named Gregor Fast. She opened the smaller envelope inside the larger one. Inside was a single index card, handwritten, 4 words and a number. She never left home, and below it, her father's private contact number, the one that changed every 90 days and was known to fewer than 12 people alive. She stood up slowly. She was aware of her own breathing, steady, but only because she was making it steady. She was aware of Adrian standing somewhere behind her and to the left. She was aware of the emergency lights in the corridor outside and the sound of the building's ventilation system and the distant bass hum of the city 11 floors below. She was aware that she had been catastrophically wrong about something, and she needed 30 seconds to understand exactly what it was before she could move. She never left home. The card was not addressed to her. It was information. A note meant to be found, here, in this hiding place, at approximately this moment, which meant Marcus had known she would come here, had left it for her, which meant tonight had not been a window of opportunity. It had been an invitation. "We need to leave," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that, distantly. "What is—" "Now, Adrian." She was already moving, laptop under her arm, hard drive in her jacket pocket, envelope folded and placed beside it. She was at the door when her phone vibrated. She looked at it without breaking stride. Dara. One word, out. She broke into a run. Botam. They came out of the stairwell into the parking structure at ground level, and Elena already had her phone to her ear before the door had fully closed behind them. "Talk to me," she said. "2 vehicles entered the structure from the north entrance 40 seconds ago, Dara said, and her voice had the flat, rapid quality it took on when she was managing active threat. "Black SUVs, no plates. I count at least 4 people per vehicle. Where are you?" "Level 2, east side. I'm moving." A pause. The sound of an engine. "There's a 3rd vehicle on the street, stationary. Been there since we arrived. I didn't flag it because it didn't move. It moved 2 minutes ago." 3 vehicles. 8. This was not improvised. Elena grabbed Adrian's arm without looking at him and changed direction, away from where Dara had been parked, toward the north wall of the structure and the maintenance corridor she had noted on the building schematic she'd studied before coming in. She had studied the building schematic the way she studied everything, looking for the exits that weren't labeled as exits. "The maintenance corridor on the north wall," she said to Dara. "Can you get there?" "Give me 90 seconds. "You have 60. She pulled Adrian through a door marked Authorized Personnel and into a concrete corridor that smelled of exhaust and cleaning chemicals, dimly lit by a single strip of fluorescent that buzzed and flickered at the far end. Adrian was breathing harder than she was. Not from the running, she thought, but from the adrenal shock of the situation landing fully. "Who are those people?" he said. "Marcus's employers." She kept moving. "Or their security team. Same outcome either way." "How did they know we were here?" "Because Marcus wanted us here." A pause behind her as he processed that. Then, "The files. He left them for us to find. He left them for me to find." She reached the far end of the corridor and pushed through another door into a secondary loading area. Concrete. Empty. One rolling door on the far wall that opened to the alley behind the building. "He needed me inside this building tonight. In that office. In range." In range of what? She didn't answer immediately because she was listening. Footsteps. Somewhere above them in the structure. The organized sound of people moving with purpose. She looked at the rolling door. It had a manual release. She crossed to it and pulled. The door went up with a sound that felt enormous in the concrete space, and the night air came in cold and carrying the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet but was close. The alley was empty. For now. Her phone buzzed. "Dara. Allie. Coming to you." 20 seconds later, headlights cut around the corner at the far end of the alley, and Dara's car pulled up with the specific controlled urgency of someone who learned to drive under circumstances that required not drawing attention while moving very fast. Elena pushed Adrian toward the car and got in after him. The door hadn't fully closed before Dara was moving. "North," Dara said. "The ship," Elena said. In the back seat, Adrian was pressed against the door, watching the parking structure entrance recede as they pulled out of the alley onto a side street. His face, in the intermittent light of street lamps, had gone through something while they were running and arrived somewhere Elena recognized. The specific stripped-down focus of a person who has had all available exits closed and is working with what remains. "The files," he said. "You took them." "Yes. If Marcus wanted you to find them..." He stopped, started again. "What's on them that he wanted you to see?" She looked at him. In the dark of the back seat, with the city moving past the windows and Dara taking a left that pressed them both against their respective doors, she told him about the timestamp, the 3 years, the photograph. She watched his face while she told him, because she needed to see his reaction, and she needed to see it unguarded. He went very still. 4 years ago, he said, 3 months into our marriage. Someone was watching the ship, he paused. Watching you. Another pause, longer. And they placed Marcus with me. Yes. The next pause was the longest. She watched him work through it, watched him go back, mentally, through 4 years of his professional life with Marcus Hale in it. 4 years of advice, of recommendations, of the slow and patient work of becoming the person a man trusted most. She watched Adrian dismantle it, and she didn't try to help him because this was the kind of reckoning that had to be done alone. "He told me to divorce you," Adrian said. His voice had gone very quiet. "I know." He said... He stopped. His jaw was tight. "He made a very careful case, over about 8 months, that you were isolated, that you didn't have your own life, that staying in the marriage was..." He used the word stagnant. He said I was using you as a... He stopped again. "I was very good at making it sound like concern, like he was looking out for both of us." "He was very good at his job," Elena said. "Don't." Adrian's voice had an edge she hadn't heard from him before, not the corporate cold, which she knew well, but something rawer underneath it. "Don't make it easier than it is. He manipulated me, but I listened. I let him." He looked at her directly in the dark. "I wanted to believe it. Some part of me. Because it was easier than..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. She understood what he meant. It was easier to believe the marriage was the problem than to sit with the possibility that the problem was inside him, that the thing making him feel stagnant and constrained and insufficient was not the quiet woman who never asked anything of him, but the standards he'd internalized from a father who taught him that human connection was a weakness to be managed. Marcus hadn't manufactured that. He'd just fed it. "The index card," Adrian said. She told him about that too. He'd been quiet about it until now. "She never left home," he repeated. "What does that mean?" She had been thinking about that for the last 12 minutes, and she had arrived at an interpretation she did not like. It means someone wants my father to know that my cover has been compromised since almost the beginning, that I never actually disappeared from their radar when I built the Marlowe identity, that the safety I thought I'd created, she paused, was an illusion they permitted. The car went over a rough patch of road and swayed slightly. Dara corrected without comment. They let you hide, Adrian said slowly, because having you hidden and accessible was more useful than forcing a confrontation immediately. Yes. So they've had your location for 4 years. And they've been using it. She looked out the window. The harbor was visible now, the water black and broken into fragments of light. The leverage isn't the photograph. The leverage is the knowledge that they had the photograph and didn't use it for 4 years. They want my father to understand that they've been in a position to act against him for 4 years and chose not to. She paused. That's not a threat. That's a demonstration of capability. They're telling him what they're capable of and giving him the chance to come to the table voluntarily. And if he doesn't? She didn't answer that. Cassian was waiting on the dock when Dara pulled up. He took one look at Elena's face as she got out of the car and turned without a word and led them up the gangway and into the salon and closed the door. He looked at the hard drive in her hand, the envelope. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She watched his face while he looked at the photograph. She had spent her entire life learning to read her father's face, and she would freely admit, still not always successful at it. He had layers of controlled response that she had never fully mapped, but she could read the photograph landing. She could read the specific quality of stillness that moved through him as he looked at the timestamp. He set it down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you known this was possible? That they might have found me early? I considered it. I didn't let myself—" She stopped, started again. "I discounted it. The Marlowe identity was clean. I tested it thoroughly. I told myself if there had been a breach, I would have seen evidence of—" "You didn't discount it because the identity was clean," Cassian said. His voice was not unkind. It was precise. "You discounted it because believing you were hidden was the only way to stay." The silence that followed that sentence was the most complete silence in the room. Adrian, to his credit, did not react. He was sitting at the far end of the table and he looked at his hands and he was quiet, which was exactly the right thing to be. Elena looked at her father. "I know," she said. "The index card." Cassian picked it up, looked at it, turned it over. His private contact number on the back of an index card, in someone's handwriting. "This is Fast's writing," he said. She had suspected. She hadn't been certain. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He set it down carefully, the way you set something down when you don't want to convey what touching it makes you feel. "Gregor Fast has had your location for 4 years and sat on it." He looked at her. "Do you understand what that means?" "It means he wants something specific, something he couldn't get through direct confrontation." "He wants the network," Cassian said. "Not information about it, not leverage over the people in it. He wants the architecture itself, the relationships, the operational infrastructure." He paused. "He's been positioning himself to take over what I built, not destroy it, acquire it." Another pause. "Which means he needs me to hand it over, which means he needs something to compel me." The room was very quiet. Elena saw it a half second before her father said it. She saw it, and her hands went still on the table, and she felt the cold current become something else. Not cold anymore, but the specific heat of a realization arriving fully formed. "You," Cassian said. He looked at her directly, and his voice was steady and flat and contained the specific quality of a man who has seen the shape of the trap and is still in it. He positioned you near Vossler's network. He has documentation of your presence here. He has your photograph with me. He has 4 years of your location data." He paused. "He's going to give me a choice. Transfer operational control of the network voluntarily, or watch him use everything he has to dismantle your safety so thoroughly that running again becomes impossible." The word impossible sat in the room between them. Adrian spoke. "There's another option," he said. Both of them looked at him. He had his elbows on the table and his hands clasped in front of him, and he was looking at the index card with an expression that was completely focused and entirely without the performance of confidence that had characterized almost every interaction Elena had had with him for 8 years. This was a different version. This was the version underneath the version. He needs the documentation to have leverage, Adrian said. The photograph, the financial records, the communication logs on the laptop. He paused. What if the documentation didn't exist anymore? What if everything Marcus collected, everything Fast has been building for 4 years, was gone? Cassian looked at him with an expression Elena had never seen her father direct at another person in her presence. It was the expression of someone registering with surprise that they had underestimated someone. The files on that drive, Adrian said, came from Marcus's office. Marcus chose to leave them. He knew we'd take them. He looked at Elena. What if that was the point? What if the drive is the mechanism? What if taking it out of that office triggered something, a notification, a signal, and right now somewhere the copies are already moving? Elena felt the implication land with the specific precision of something sharp. She looked at the hard drive. She picked it up, turned it over, ran her thumb along the seam of the casing on the bottom edge where the manufacturer's label was. The label was slightly raised. Not much. A millimeter. She reached into her jacket and found the small multi-tool she carried. Had carried for 11 years since her father gave it to her on her 21st birthday and told her a person with the right small tool was never fully without options. She worked the flat edge under the label. Beneath it, adhered to the casing with a piece of conductive tape, was a transmitter, smaller than a thumbnail, 3 months old, based on the generation of the hardware. She set it on the table. The three of them looked at it. He tracked it, Adrian said. He tracked us, Elena said. This drive has been live since we picked it up. They know exactly where we are. She looked at her father. He looked at her. In the distance, very faint, she heard something. And then Cassian heard it too, because his head came up and his eyes went to the window and his hand moved to the inside of his jacket with the particular economy of someone for whom that movement was as natural as breathing. It was the sound of engines. Not one, several. Moving across the water. Dara appeared in the salon doorway, phone in hand, face arranged in the controlled urgency Elena knew meant immediate threat. 2 vessels, she said, coming in from the east. Fast. She paused. Armed. Cassian Ravel straightened. He looked at his daughter, then at Adrian, then back at his daughter. Well, he said very quietly, I suppose this is where it begins. Elena looked at the transmitter on the table, at the hard drive, at the envelope, at the index card with her father's number on it in Gregor Fast's handwriting. She looked at Adrian, who was on his feet now, watching her with the complete attention of someone who has made a decision and is waiting to find out what it costs. She looked at her father, who had built a life in the dark and raised her to navigate it, and who was looking at her now not as a thing to be protected, but as the person he'd always known she was, the person he'd been waiting, quietly, for the rest of the world to discover. She picked up the transmitter and held it between her thumb and forefinger, and she looked at the door that led to the deck, and beyond the door at the dark water where the sound of engines was growing louder, and she understood with complete clarity that the version of herself she had been for 8 years, careful, invisible, contained, always managing the distance between who she was and who she allowed herself to be, was about to become permanently insufficient for what came next. She set the transmitter down. She looked at Dara. Kill the lights on the deck, all of them. Done. Dara was already moving. Adrian, she turned to him, you stay below. Whatever you hear, you don't come up. Elena, that's not negotiable. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not argument, but the specific expression of a man learning, in real time, the difference between a woman he thought he knew and the woman who had actually been standing beside him for 8 years. He sat down. Okay, he said. She looked at her father. Cassian had his jacket straightened and his expression arranged into the particular stillness that she knew, from a lifetime of watching him, meant he was completely prepared for whatever walked through the door. He was 61 years old, and he moved like someone who had never once in his life been surprised into paralysis. The drive, she said. Everything Marcus collected. It doesn't matter if they have copies, because the leverage only works if we're afraid of exposure. She held his eyes. I'm done being afraid of exposure. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. Then very quietly, "Your mother would have said the same thing." It was the highest compliment he knew how to give. The engines were close now. Very close. The sound vibrating through the whole of the meridian in a way she could feel in her sternum. Dara came back through the door. 2 minutes, she said. Elena picked up the transmitter from the table. She walked to the porthole on the north side of the salon and opened it and dropped the transmitter into the black water below without ceremony. Then she straightened, rolled her sleeves to the elbow, and looked at the two people in the room she trusted most in the world. "When they board," she said, "let them. Don't engage until I say." She paused. Fast wants a negotiation. He spent 4 years building toward one. That means he needs us alive and present and afraid. She let a beat pass. "We're going to give him present." Dara almost smiled. Almost. Cassian said nothing. He simply moved to her left and slightly behind. The position he had taken beside her mother in the old photographs Elena had memorized in childhood. The position that said without words, "I am not in front of you, and I am not behind you. I am with you." The first hook caught the railing of the meridian with a sound like a gunshot in the dark. Elena breathed in, breathed out. She walked toward the deck door and pushed it open, and the night air came in cold and salt-sharp, and she stepped out into it with her eyes open and her hands steady and absolutely nothing left to hide. The first man over the railing was professional about it. That was what Elena noticed before anything else. The economy of the movement, the way he came over the rail and landed and immediately had his sight lines established before his second foot touched the deck. Not hired muscle. Trained. The second man followed with the same precision, and then a third, and by the time the fourth had cleared the railing, Elena had a count and a read, and she was standing in the center of the deck with her hands visible and her weight balanced slightly forward on the balls of her feet, and her face arranged into an expression that communicated nothing useful to anyone looking at it. 4 on deck. More on the vessel below. She could hear the engine idling, hear the low exchange of voices across the water. A second boat somewhere to the stern, quieter, running dark. The man who came last was not a guard. He was thin, older than she'd expected from the file photographs, with the kind of face that had been deliberately unmemorable for so long that it had actually become so. Medium height, gray coat. He moved across the deck with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at Elena the way you look at a piece of architecture you've studied in drawings for years and are finally standing in front of, with the specific satisfaction of a person whose projection has proven accurate. Gregor Fast said, "You dropped my transmitter in the harbor." "It seemed appropriate," Elena said. It was a gesture. He stopped 8 feet from her. Close enough for conversation, far enough to be outside most people's comfortable striking range. Someone had taught him that, she noted, or he'd learned it himself. "I respect gestures. They tell you what someone thinks is important." He tilted his head slightly. "You think your location is important. You don't want me to have it." "I don't want you to have anything." "Yes." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, more like the satisfaction of a correct prediction. "That's what makes this interesting. Most people, when they understand the position they're in, they bargain. They start calculating what they can afford to give up." He looked at her steadily. "You don't bargain. You reframe." "I'm not here to be analyzed." "No." He glanced past her toward the salon door. "You're here because you made a decision in the last few minutes to stop being afraid of exposure." That was the transmitter. That was what the gesture meant. He paused. "I'm curious whether you've thought through what that decision actually costs." The deck moved slightly under them. The water had chop on it, not serious but persistent, and the two vessels knocking against each other created a rhythm that Elena felt through the soles of her shoes. Behind Fast, his 4 men had spread to the corners of the deck, with the practiced positioning of people who were not there to watch a conversation but to control the environment in which it happened. The salon door opened. Cassian Ravel stepped onto the deck. Fast turned. And this was the first moment Elena saw something genuine move through Fast's face, something that wasn't performance or precision. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The slight intake of breath, the fractional widening of the eyes, of a man confronting something he'd spent years building toward and still wasn't entirely prepared for. "Cassian," he said. "Gregor." Her father's voice was the same voice he used for everything, unhurried, complete. carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never in his life needed volume to command a room. He stopped beside Elena. Not in front of her. Beside her. You've gone to considerable effort. 4 years, Fast said. It required patience. Most worthwhile things do. Cassian looked at him with the expression Elena knew meant he was doing rapid, comprehensive assessment and filing the results. You look older. We both do. A pause. The water moved under them. Somewhere in the city behind the harbor, a siren rose and fell and disappeared. You want the network, Cassian said. Not a question. I want a partnership, Fast said. The word want implies I need something you're not inclined to give. I'm suggesting a different framing, an arrangement between people who understand each other's capabilities. You boarded my ship with armed men. A precaution. You would have done the same. I would not have needed to. Cassian said it without emphasis, which made it considerably more pointed than emphasis would have. I don't require theater to make a point. Something tightened around Fast's eyes. The documentation I have is currently on a drive in my salon, Elena said, and on a laptop that we've had disconnected from every network for the past 40 minutes. Whatever copies you think you're holding, I'd like to understand exactly what you believe their value is. Fast looked at her. She held his gaze. The photograph, he said. Your real identity, attached to the Vossler household for 8 years. Your father's private contact number. The evidence that Cassian Ravel's infrastructure and a legitimate corporation have been operating in proximity for nearly a decade. He paused. Individually, these are inconveniences. Together, they create a picture that certain authorities in 3 jurisdictions would find worth examining. Authorities you control, Elena said. Authorities I have relationships with. A distinction he clearly felt was important. I'm not threatening prosecution. I'm describing leverage. The difference matters. It doesn't, she said. A beat. She took a step toward him. One of his men moved and she looked at the man and the man stopped. Not because she'd said anything, not because she'd done anything, but because of the quality of the look. The specific flatness of someone for whom the threat was not a performance. Here's what your documentation actually shows, she said. It shows that for 4 years you had information you could have acted on and didn't. That's not leverage. That's a record of hesitation. She held his eyes. And hesitation, in the industry you claim to understand, is a confession of limitation. Fast was quiet for a moment. She watched him recalibrate. The man inside, he said, Vossler, is not part of this conversation. He's the mechanism through which you maintained your position for 8 years. His network, his corporation, his name, that's the structure that kept Elena Ravel invisible while she stayed operational. He paused deliberately. If that structure becomes public, he's destroyed. Not inconvenienced. Destroyed. Criminal liability exposure in 4 countries based on the Rotterdam contracts alone. He looked at her with something that was almost respect. I don't think you want that. She didn't answer immediately. She let the silence do its work. This was the thing about Fast she had understood from the documentation, from the 4 years of observing his methods through the residue he left in other people's operations. He was brilliant at reading what people wanted to protect and using that knowledge to constrain them. He had spent 4 years constructing a picture of what Elena Ravel valued, her father, her cover, and now, newly, Adrian Vossler. And he believed that picture was a map of her limits. He was right that it was a map. He was wrong about what it mapped. The salon door opened a second time. Adrian stepped onto the deck. Elena didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Fast, and she heard Adrian's footsteps cross the deck and stop somewhere to her right and slightly behind, and she felt, rather than saw, Fast's reassessment. The rapid recalculation of a man who had built a model and is watching one of his variables behave unexpectedly. Mr. Vossler, Fast said. There was something careful in his voice now. You've been stealing from my company for 3 years, Adrian said. His voice was even. Not corporate even, not performed even, but the even of someone who has moved past anger into something more useful. Through Marcus Hale, through Veritex Solutions, through 7 recipients I now have names and account numbers for. He paused. I have a compliance attorney on a recorded line right now who has received a complete file. If I don't check in within the next 20 minutes, that file goes to every relevant authority automatically. Fast looked at him. That file also exposes everything, Adrian said. Yes, including the Rotterdam connections, including 8 years of Elena's presence in my household, including my own negligence in failing to detect the fraud. He paused. I'm aware of what it exposes. I've made my decision about what that costs. The deck was very quiet. Even the water seemed to settle for a moment. Elena looked at Adrian. I was looking at Fast, and his jaw was set, and he had his phone in his left hand with the screen visible. A call, active, timer running. She looked at the call timer, 14 minutes, 32 seconds. He had made the call before he came on deck. He had done it without telling her. She felt something shift in her chest that she did not have time to examine. Fast's composure, which had been considerable, developed its first visible crack. It was small, a tightening around the mouth, a brief movement of his eyes toward his men that was too quick and not quite controlled. You're bluffing, he said. I'm not a man who bluffs, Adrian said. I'm a man who makes bad decisions and then has to live with them. This is me trying to make one that's worth living with. You'll go to prison. Maybe. Probably not. I have very good attorneys and I was genuinely defrauded. But possibly. He didn't look away. Are you? Another silence, longer this time. One of Fast's men, the one near the port railing, who had been still as furniture for the past 10 minutes, shifted his weight. It was an involuntary thing, the kind of movement a body makes when the brain running it starts to feel uncertain. Elena clocked it without showing she'd clocked it. Stand down, she said to the man, quietly. You're not getting paid enough for what comes next. The man looked at Fast. Fast didn't look back at him. And in that absence of eye contact, something in the man's posture changed. Fast said, What exactly do you think comes next? Cassian, Elena said. Her father reached into his breast pocket and removed his phone and pressed a single button. He held it where Fast could see the screen. On it was a live map. The harbor, the 2 vessels Fast had arrived on, and 4 other vessels Elena had not mentioned and Fast had not known about, positioned at compass points around the meridian, with the specific placement of people who had been there for some time and were waiting for a word. Cassian said, I've been in this harbor for 3 days, Gregor. You've been in this city for less than 12 hours. I know where your drivers are. I know which hotel you came from and what name you used and who made your reservation. He paused. I also know that the 2 men you left in that hotel room have been having a very informative conversation with 2 of my people for the past 40 minutes. Another pause. The backup you believe you have is not where you believe it is. Fast looked at the map, then at Cassian, then at Elena. She watched him do the arithmetic. She had done it herself, an hour ago on the meridian, with her father standing across from her and Adrian beside her, and the arithmetic coming out the same way no matter how she arranged the numbers. Fast had leverage. They had position. Leverage was a forcing mechanism. Position was a fact. Facts won. The file, Fast said, finally. His voice had changed. Not broken. Fast was not the kind of man who broke, but altered. The performance stripped back to something more functional. The one on the drive, the Rotterdam documentation. What about it? Elena said. It goes both ways. He held her gaze. There are names on those transaction records that are not mine and not Hale's. Names that certain people would prefer stayed buried. He paused. Names that would be useful to your father. Elena felt it before she fully understood it. The recognition of a pivot. Fast was not surrendering. I was repositioning. He was doing what she'd told Adrian he would do. Recalculating what he could afford to give up and offering the thing with the highest apparent value and the lowest actual cost to him personally. He was offering to trade. She looked at her father. Cassian's face was unreadable. But she saw his eyes, and she knew what they said, because she had grown up learning to read what her father's eyes said when his face said nothing. Your call. In 16 years of working beside him, in the years before Elena Marlowe and the years she was reconstructing now, he had given her that look a handful of times. It was the look that meant she had all the information, and he trusted her judgment, and whatever she chose, he would move with her. She breathed in. She looked at Fast, at his gray coat and his careful face, and the 4 years he had spent building a trap around her life, and the life of her father, and the life of a man she had spent 8 years trying to protect from exactly this kind of thing. She thought about the index card. She never left home. The implication that she had been visible, tracked, monitored, used as a variable in someone else's calculation for 4 years of a life she had believed was her own. She thought about what it meant to reframe. "The names," she said. "All of them, every document on that drive and the laptop. You give us clean copies, authenticated with your own signature confirming their provenance." She paused. "In exchange, the 20-minute clock stops. The file doesn't move, and you walk off this ship." Fast was still. "That's it?" he said. "That's not it," she said. "You also give us Marcus Hale, his location, his contacts, and the full operational record of what you had him doing inside Vossler Industries." She held his eyes. "And you remove yourself from every active operation connected to anything in this harbor within 48 hours. You're not offering me anything. I'm offering you the chance to make this a transaction instead of a war." She let a beat pass. "You know what a war with my father costs. You've known for 20 years, which is why you've been building leverage instead of engaging directly." She took one more step toward him, and this time none of his men moved at all. "You're very good at what you do, Gregor, but you designed a 4-year operation around the assumption that I would behave like someone who was afraid. I'm not afraid, which means the operation doesn't work." Another beat. "Take the transaction." The harbor sounds filled the silence. Water, wind, the distant city. One of the men near the stern railing had lowered his hands to his sides. Not raised them, lowered them. The difference was significant. He was no longer in ready posture. He was in waiting posture. Fast looked at the phone in Cashin's hand, at the map, at the 4 vessels positioned like compass points around the meridian in the dark water. Then he looked at Adrian, who was standing with his phone in his hand, and the call timer at 16 minutes 40 seconds, and an expression on his face that Elena had never seen there before in 8 years but recognized instantly, because it was the expression of someone who has decided what they're willing to lose and has made a kind of peace with it. Fast looked back at Elena. "Marcus Hale is in a safe house," he said, "in a city I will give you the name of. He does not know the full scope of what he was part of." A pause. "He believed he was running a corporate intelligence operation. Nothing more." "I'll determine what he knew," Elena said. "Yes." Fast was quiet for a moment. "You'll need the second drive." She went very still. "There's a second drive." "There's always a second drive." Something in his face, not quite regret, but its distant functional cousin. "In the safe house, with Hale. It contains what he doesn't know he has." He paused. "It contains the original documentation from the organization that contracted me. Names, accounts, the full chain." Another pause. "It's worth considerably more than what you think you're getting tonight." Elena looked at him. She had been in enough negotiations to recognize the moment when the other person offers the thing they were always going to offer but held back until they had no other currency. This was that moment. The second drive was what Fast had intended to trade from the beginning, had always known he would eventually trade, but had structured the evening so that by the time he offered it, Elena would feel she'd won it through force rather than received it through his design. She recognized it. She also recognized that the second drive, whatever was on it, was real. The offer was genuine, even if the framing was theatrical. Fast didn't deal in false currency at the final stage. It was the only thing in his reputation that everyone who knew him agreed on. She looked at her father one more time. He looked back at her. She said, "Dara." Dara appeared in the salon doorway immediately, which meant she'd been there for some time. "Ready," she said. "We need a written agreement," Elena said to Fast. "Signed, with your biometric on the authentication." She paused. "You have a pen, or do you need one?" Fast reached into his coat pocket. He had a pen. Of course he did. He looked at her as he uncapped it, and in the look was something she hadn't expected to find there, something that was almost under several layers of professional remove, a form of acknowledgement. Not admiration, something more specific than that. The look of someone who has spent 4 years building a model of another person and is standing in the gap between the model and the reality. "Your father raised you well," he said. "My father raised me," she said. That was enough. She reached out and took the pen from his hand before he could choose the gesture of offering it, and she turned to the table Dara had produced from somewhere with the efficiency that made Dara irreplaceable, and she uncapped the pen and began writing the terms of the agreement in her own hand, quickly, without hesitation. because she had been composing it in her head since the moment she stepped onto the deck, and had known, with the part of her mind that never went quiet, that this was how the night would end. Not in violence, in language, in the precise and binding power of words written down and witnessed. The water moved under the meridian. The harbor lights made broken paths across the surface. Adrian stood at her right shoulder, close enough that she was aware of his breathing. Steadier now, but still carrying the adrenaline of the past hour in its rhythm. Her father stood to her left and slightly back, watching Fast's men with the patient attention of someone who had not yet put his hand back inside his jacket, but had not forgotten why it had been there. She finished the terms. She slid the paper across the table to Fast. He read it. The reading took longer than the document's length required, which told her he was looking for the thing she'd concealed in the language, the provision that looked neutral and wasn't. She had included one. She wanted to see if he found it. He found it. She knew he'd found it by the way his eyes stopped moving for a half-second on the third paragraph, and then continued with the careful deliberateness of someone deciding whether to challenge a clause or accept it. He accepted it. He signed. He pressed his thumb to the authentication device Dara produced, and the device made a soft sound and its indicator light went from red to green, and Gregor Fast straightened and looked at Elena Ravel and said very quietly, "The city is Antwerp. The safe house address will come to your father's secure line within the hour." "If it doesn't," she said, "the 20-minute clock resumes." "It will." He capped the pen. He put it back in his coat pocket. He looked at Cassian one more time, a look that carried in it the specific weight of two people who have been parallel forces in the same world for a very long time and have arrived at a moment of renegotiation that neither fully chose and both understand is binding. "Cassian," he said. "Gregor," her father said. And then Fast turned, and his four men turned with him, and they went back over the railing with the same professional economy with which they'd arrived. And the sound of the boat's engines rose and then moved away across the water, and the harbor was quiet again, and the four vessels at compass points held their positions until Cassian sent a single word on his phone, and they too began to move. Elena set the pen down. She was aware, suddenly and comprehensively, of every part of her body. The tension in her shoulders that she'd been carrying for 6 weeks, the specific exhaustion behind her eyes, the way her hands, when she unclenched them from the pen, had left small red pressure marks on her palms. Adrian said, "Is it done?" "It started," she said. She looked at the signed agreement in Dara's hands, at the hard drive and the laptop and the manila envelope still inside on the salon table, at the harbor, clearing now, the water settling back into its ordinary dark. "Antwerp," she said. "We need to move by morning." She looked at Dara. "Can you get us a plane?" "Already working on it," Dara said. Elena nodded. She turned toward the salon door and she was 3 steps from it when Adrian said her name. Not Elena Marlowe. Not with the corporate inflection she'd heard from him for 8 years. Just her name, the way people say the name of someone they are genuinely trying to reach. She stopped. Turned. He was standing in the harbor light with his phone still in his hand and the call timer still running, and he looked at her with an expression that had been stripped of every layer of performance she'd ever seen him wear. And underneath all of it was something she recognized because she had seen it in the mirror on very specific mornings in the 8 years she'd spent trying to live alongside it without being consumed by it. It was the look of someone who finally, completely, understood what they had. "The call," she said. "Cancel it." He looked at his phone. He pressed a button. "Done," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, "for coming on deck." He said, "I wasn't going to let you do it alone." 8 years, she thought. 8 years, and it took all of this for him to find that sentence. She turned back to the door. Inside, her father was waiting, and there was work still to do, and Antwerp was 4 hours by air, and Marcus Hale was in a safe house, not knowing that the architecture of everything he'd been part of had just been signed away on the deck of a ship in a harbor while the city slept around them, and the second drive was waiting with its chain of names and accounts, and the full picture of who had built this thing and why. She pushed open the salon door. The light inside was warm and the coffee on the table had gone cold, and her father turned when she came in and looked at her face and then looked past her at Adrian, who followed her in, and something in Cassian Ravel's expression did the specific, quiet thing it had been doing since the moment he'd stepped onto that dock 3 nights ago and said, "Bring my daughter home." It settled, not into relief exactly, but into something adjacent to it, something that had Tai Aep Tuk Part 4 Dang Do. Huantang Part 4 Trung 902 been missing from his face for 5 years, and was only now, in this warm-lit salon on the water, beginning to return. He looked at Elena. She looked at him. "Antwerp," she said. He nodded once. "I'll have the pilot ready in 2 hours." She sat down at the table and pulled the laptop toward her and opened the 17C folder again and began going through the files with the methodical patience of someone who has moved past the adrenaline and arrived at the work itself. Dara came in and set a fresh cup of coffee beside her without being asked. Elena drank it without looking up. Adrian sat across from her. He didn't speak, which was the right thing to do. He watched her work, and after a moment he pulled the property trace documents toward him and began reading them, and the two of them sat in the quiet salon with the harbor water moving dark outside the windows, and worked through what remained in the same concentrated silence of people who have found, on the other side of a very long crisis, that they can occupy the same space without either one of them disappearing. Cassian stood at the window for a while, looking at the harbor. Then he sat down at the head of the table and opened his own phone and began making calls in a low, unhurried voice. At some point, Dara set a plate of food on the table that none of them had asked for, and all three of them ate from it without comment, because the body requires maintenance regardless of what the mind is occupied with, and this too was something Elena had learned at her father's table. At 1:17 in the morning, Cassian's secure line received a message. He read it. He set the phone on the table and turned it to face Elena. An address in Antwerp, a building name, a unit number, and below it, in the same terse format, 4 words that had not been part of the agreement and were not required by its terms, but were there nonetheless. The specific offering of a man who understood that the transaction was done, but the accounting was still open. Hale doesn't know everything. Elena read it twice. Then she looked at her father. "He's telling us Marcus was used more completely than Marcus knows," she said. "Yes," Cassian said, "which means the chain on that second drive goes higher than fast." "Yes." She looked at the address, at the harbor, at Adrian, who had read the message over her shoulder and was very still in the way she was beginning to recognize meant he was thinking rather than reacting, which was a version of him she had not known existed until 3 days ago. "Then it's not over," Adrian said. "No," Elena said. She closed the laptop, picked up her coffee. "But we know where it is." She looked at her father, and he looked at her, and the plane was waiting, and Antwerp was 4 hours away, and the second drive was there with everything still to come, written on it in the language of names and numbers and a chain of consequence that wound back further than any of them had yet seen. She was ready. Antwerp in November. Smelled like coal smoke and river water and the specific gray cold of a port city that has been a port city for 600 years and has stopped apologizing for its weather. They landed at a private airfield outside the city at 6:43 in the morning, and the sky was the color of old pewter and the tarmac was wet from rain that had stopped an hour before. Elena came down the air stairs first, the way she always did when she didn't know what she was walking into. Not because she was fearless, but because fear had never once helped her read an environment faster than attention did, and attention required being in front. Dara had a car waiting. 2 cars, actually. One for Cassian and his people, one for Elena and Adrian. This had been Elena's decision, made quietly on the plane while Adrian slept in the seat across from her, and her father sat at the small table at the rear of the cabin, reviewing the property trace documents she'd photographed. 2 cars meant 2 entry options. 2 entry options meant that if the address in Antwerp was a secondary trap, if Fast's delivery of it had been genuine but someone else in the chain had anticipated the move, they would not lose everything at once. She had not told Adrian about the 2-car arrangement. She had simply directed him to her car when they landed, and he had gone without questioning it, which was either trust or exhaustion or some combination that she did not yet have the vocabulary for. In the car, Adrian sat beside her and looked out the window at the city, materializing through the gray morning. The canal, the old warehouses with their brick faces, the narrow streets that hadn't changed their essential character in 3 centuries. He hadn't shaved. The stubble was past the point of being incidental and approaching the point of being deliberate, though she doubted it was deliberate. He simply hadn't had a moment in which shaving was among the available priorities. Have you been to Antwerp before? He said. Yes. When? A long time ago. She looked at the canal. With my father. I was 19. A pause. For work? Everything with my father was for work. She paused. And none of it was only work. That's the thing about growing up the way I grew up. The line between the professional and the personal doesn't exist the way it does for other people. Your education is your life. Your life is your education. She looked at him. I didn't understand until I tried to live differently how much of me was built in that space. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved past. A woman on a bicycle. A bakery with its lights on, warm yellow in the gray morning. A canal boat moving slow and patient along the water. The 8 years, he said, living as Elena Marlowe. He paused carefully. Was any of it real? She looked at him directly. All of it was real, she said. That's what you don't understand about cover. The best cover isn't a mask. It's a version of yourself that you actually inhabit. Elena Marlowe was real. The background was constructed. The person wasn't. She paused. I actually liked coffee. I actually couldn't sleep when the numbers were wrong. She stopped. Actually what? She looked back out the window. Loved you, she said. That was real. For whatever it was worth, given everything else. The word sat between them in the car with the particular weight of something that has been true for a long time and is only now being said in plain language. Adrian didn't respond immediately, and she appreciated that. Appreciated that he understood the sentence didn't require an immediate answer, that some things need a moment of silence around them to be properly received. After a while, he said quietly, "It was worth a great deal." She nodded once. She didn't look at him. She watched the city instead and let the truth of the last 4 days settle into her bones alongside the cold and the smell of the river, and she thought about what came next with the part of her mind that was always already in the next room. The building was on a canal street in the old Port District, 4 stories, brick, the kind of building that had been a warehouse and then offices and then something else. And now, on its upper floors, a series of private apartments accessed by a separate entrance on the side street. Functional, anonymous, the specific invisibility of a place that had been chosen for exactly that quality. They parked half a block away. Cassian's car came in from the other direction and stopped at the corner. Elena could see Dara in the front seat of the second car, her head still, her eyes moving. "Third floor," Elena said. "Unit 12. She looked at Adrian. "You wait here. We've had this conversation. We're going to keep having it until you accept the outcome." He looked at her. "Last night on the ship, you said I wasn't going to do it alone. That applied to both of us." She held his gaze. He held hers. I was not backing down, and she could see that this was not stubbornness. It was something more considered than stubbornness, something he had arrived at through the specific process of a man who has made a decision and understood its cost and made it anyway. She thought about the call timer at 16 minutes 40 seconds. She thought about him stepping onto the deck. "Stay behind me," she said. "Don't speak unless I ask you to. And if something goes wrong..." "I follow your lead," he said. "If something goes wrong," she said again, precisely, "you run. You don't stay. You don't help. You run." She held his eyes. "Do you understand?" A pause. "Yes," he said. They got out of the car. The side entrance lock took Dara 11 seconds, which Elena counted, watching the street in both directions while Dara worked. Then they were inside, in a stairwell that smelled of damp concrete and old paint, and they went up in single file. Dara first, then Elena, then Adrian, then one of Cassian's men who had appeared from the second car without being summoned, a large and very quiet man named Boric, who had been with her father for 14 years and communicated primarily through positioning. Cassian himself was not with them. He was in the car, on his phone, managing the external picture. This too had been Elena's decision, made on the plane. Her father's presence at the confrontation would shift the dynamic in ways she couldn't fully predict, because Marcus Hale did not know Cassian and would therefore be unpredictable in his reaction. Unknown reactions in confined spaces were the specific category of risk she liked least. Third floor. Unit 12. The door was a standard apartment door, solid core, single deadbolt, a small camera above the frame that had been disabled, Dara noted with a gesture, recently and professionally. Someone had been here before them. Elena felt the cold threat again. Not panic, never panic, but the specific alertness of someone whose environment has just communicated that the variables have changed. She looked at Dara. Dara looked at the door. The camera wire had been cut cleanly, close to the mount, with something sharp. Within the last few hours, based on the clean edge of the cut and the absence of dust settlement. She tried the door handle. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and went in low and fast, the way her father had taught her in a different stairwell, in a different city when she was 17, and the apartment resolved itself in her perception in the first 2 seconds. One main room, kitchenette to the left, 2 doors at the back. One open, one closed. Furniture sparse. A table with a laptop on it, open, screen dark. A chair pulled out from the table. A coffee cup on the counter that had been recently used. She could see the steam residue on the inside from 3 feet away. The open door at the back led to a bathroom. Empty. The closed door was the bedroom. She crossed to it and turned the handle and pushed. Marcus Hale was sitting on the edge of the bed. He was not restrained. He was not armed as far as she could see. He was a man of 53 in a wrinkled shirt and dark trousers, with the particular hollowed-out quality of someone who has not slept properly in several days and has spent those days understanding, incrementally, that the situation they believe they were managing has been managing them. He looked at Elena when she came through the door. He looked at Adrian behind her. Something moved across his face, complex, unresolved, the face of a man confronting 2 people he had wronged in different ways and at different scales, and who are both now standing in the same doorway. "I wondered which of you would come," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "I thought it would be you." He was looking at Elena. "I didn't think he'd be with you." "Sit still," Elena said. "I'm not going anywhere." He gestured at the room with a kind of exhausted openness. "Look, I'm just sitting here. I've been just sitting here. I've been here for 3 days. Whoever Fast sent to check in hasn't come since yesterday morning." He looked at his hands. "I think I've been abandoned." "You have," Elena said. She came further into the room and Dara positioned herself at the door, and Adrian stayed in the frame, which was the right thing to do. "Fast negotiated you as a concession last night. Your location, your contacts, your operational record." She looked at him steadily. "You're not his asset anymore. You're his exit cost." Marcus received that information with the stillness of someone who suspected it was coming and still finds the confirmation arriving harder than the suspicion. He looked at the floor, then at Adrian. "I'm sorry," he said. Adrian said nothing. "I know that's—" Marcus stopped, started again. "I know it doesn't cover what I did. I understand that. I'm not saying it because I think it changes anything. I'm saying it because I've been sitting in this room for 3 days, and it's the only honest thing I have left." "What did you think you were doing?" Adrian's voice was controlled, but only just. She could hear what was underneath it, the specific compression of a man keeping his anger in a functional shape rather than letting it expand to its natural size. 4 years. You sat across from me for 4 years. I was supposed to be compiling network data, shipping contacts, logistics relationships. Marcus looked at him. "They told me it was corporate intelligence, that they were building a competitor profile, that nobody would be—" He stopped. "I knew it wasn't clean. I'm not going to tell you I didn't know that. But I told myself it was the kind of thing that happened in this industry all the time and nobody got hurt." He paused. "Then they told me about her." He looked at Elena. "They showed me the photograph," he said. "The one on the ship. They told me who she was. And they told me that if I didn't continue, if I tried to pull out, they would deliver that photograph to the people who'd been looking for her for 4 years." He held Elena's gaze with the honesty of someone who has nothing left to protect. "I thought I was keeping you safe. I know how that sounds." "It sounds like a story you told yourself," Elena said. "Yes." He didn't argue it. "It is." He looked at his hands again. "The divorce. I thought if you were gone from the company's orbit, they'd lose interest. That the photograph would lose its value. That I could wind the operation down without—" He stopped. "I made it worse. I understand that now. I made it considerably worse." "You were being used the same way you were using Adrian," Elena said, "by people who were always going to discard you when the operation matured. She looked at him steadily. The difference is Adrian didn't know he was being used. You chose. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The second drive, Elena said. Fast told us it's here. Marcus reached under the mattress without being asked. He produced a hard drive, smaller than the one from the office, black, with a piece of tape on the side on which someone had written, in blue pen, a single word, principal. He held it out. Elena took it. She turned it over. No transmitter on this one. She checked the seam, the label, the port covers. Clean. What's on it? She said. The full chain. Marcus looked tired in a way that went beyond sleep deprivation. Fast's client, the organization that contracted him, their names, their accounts, the original brief they gave him, which was not what he told me it was. He paused. What they actually wanted wasn't your father's network. She went still. They wanted the documentation your father holds, Marcus said. The records from 40 years of operation, not the network itself. The proof of who used it, governments, corporations, individuals in positions of significant authority who've had business with Cassian Ravel's operation over 4 decades. He looked at her. That's what this was always about, not the shipping routes, the archive. The room was very quiet. Elena thought about her father on the plane, reviewing the property traces. She thought about the way he'd looked at the index card, the specific quality of his stillness. She wondered, not for the first time, how much of what she'd been analyzing her father had already understood and was waiting, with his characteristic patience, for her to arrive at independently. Who is the principal? She said. Marcus pointed at the drive in her hand. It's all there. He paused. His name is Aldrich Vorn. I know the name, Elena said. She did. She hadn't expected to, but she did. From a conversation 11 years ago on another ship, when she'd been sitting with her father going through a list of people who had made credible attempts to access certain categories of his records, and her father had pointed to a name near the bottom of the list and said, without inflection, this one is patient. She had filed it and moved on and had not thought of it in 11 years. Aldrich Vorn. Patience had apparently been a consistent characteristic. She looked at Adrian. He was watching her face with the focused attention he'd been giving her since the deck of the Meridian, the attention of someone learning to read a new language in real time. She looked back at Marcus. The compliance filing Adrian made last night, she said. It covered the fraud inside Vossler Industries. It didn't cover Vorn's organization. She paused. I need your testimony. Documented, authenticated, on record with an independent legal authority. Everything you know about the chain from Vorn to Fast to you. She held his gaze. That's what keeps you out of prison. That and the fact that you just handed me this drive voluntarily. I know, Marcus said. I was going to. He said it without drama. I've been sitting here for 3 days thinking about what I was going to do when someone finally came through that door. Whether I was going to run or whether I was going to... He gestured, a small, tired movement. This. Whatever this is. This is the right thing, Adrian said. His voice had changed. The compression was gone, replaced with something flatter and more final. It's not forgiveness. I want you to be clear about that. I don't know if I'll get there, but it's the right thing. Marcus nodded. He didn't ask for forgiveness. That, Elena thought, was the most honest thing he'd done since they walked in. The next 4 hours were not dramatic. They were the specific hard work of aftermath, Dara on the phone with a legal authority she trusted in Brussels, arranging the documentation process. Boric standing outside the apartment door with the patient immovability of a structural element. Elena at the table with the second drive and a clean laptop she'd carried in her bag, going through the files on principle with the methodical attention the material required. Adrian sat across from her and did not try to help and did not try to talk. And after the first hour, he went to the kitchenette and found coffee and made it without asking and set a cup beside her without interrupting. And this small, practical act of attention, the specific intelligence of knowing what someone needs without being told, cracked something open in her chest in a way that 4 days of crisis and confrontation and fear had not. She did not say anything. She drank the coffee and kept working. What was on the drive was more than Marcus had described, and what Marcus had described was already more than Elena had anticipated. Aldrich Vorn's operation was not a criminal organization in the traditional sense. It was something more contemporary and in some ways more dangerous, a private intelligence firm operating under legitimate corporate cover, with clients in 6 governments and a specific long-term interest in the records held by individuals like Cassian Ravel, who sat at the intersection of legitimate and illegitimate power. The goal was not extortion in the crude sense. The goal was what the brief described, in clean corporate language, as strategic leverage normalization. The acquisition of information about powerful people's past compromises, to be held and used not as blackmail, but as a permanent, silent form of control. They had been building it for 11 years. Vorn was the architect. Fast had been the acquisition mechanism for this particular target, and Marcus had been, as he'd said, the mechanism's mechanism. A man who thought he was running corporate intelligence and was, in fact, the forward edge of something considerably larger than himself. She documented all of it. She cross-referenced the accounts. She identified 4 individuals named in the brief who were currently in positions of governmental authority in 3 countries, and she noted them separately because their presence in the chain changed the calculus of how the information was used and by whom. At some point, she became aware that Cassian was in the room. She didn't know when he'd come in. I was simply there, standing near the door, reading something on his phone, and when she looked up, he looked back at her and she held up the drive and he crossed the room and sat down beside her, and she walked him through what she'd found. He listened the way he always listened. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. "Vorn," he said, "you knew." "I suspected, for some time." He looked at the screen, at the names. "I didn't know the scope." He was quiet. "I should have told you about the list, the one from 11 years ago." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He looked at her. She looked at him. This was the conversation they would need to have fully at some point. The conversation about information withheld between 2 people who both operated on a need-to-know basis and had each decided, independently and repeatedly, that the other didn't need to know. It was, she understood, the same structural problem that had existed in a different form in her marriage. And the fact that it existed in both relationships was probably information about her rather than about the individual men involved. She filed that thought for later. "Later," she said aloud. He understood what she meant. "Later," he agreed. They were back in the air by 3 in the afternoon. Marcus was in the custody of the Brussels attorney, not arrested, not free, but in the specific legal limbo of a cooperative witness undergoing formal documentation. His testimony, the attorney had confirmed, was sufficient to open investigations in 3 jurisdictions. The process would take months, possibly longer. It would not be clean or quick or satisfying in the way that conclusions in stories are supposed to be satisfying. Elena understood that. Real accountability rarely moved at the speed of narrative. On the plane, she sat in the same seat she'd occupied on the way out and looked at the same oval of sky, lighter now. The cloud cover had broken over the channel and there was actual blue above them, thin and pale and cold-looking but present. She looked at it and let herself be still for the first time in what felt like a month. Cassian was in the back of the cabin, sleeping, actually sleeping, which she'd rarely seen him do in transit, and which told her something about what the last 4 days had cost him that he wouldn't have said directly. Dara was going through the drive documentation with the focused efficiency that made her extraordinary at her work. Adrian was in the seat across from Elena, awake, looking at nothing in particular out his own window. After a while he said without turning, "What happens now? With your father's records? With Vorn?" "The documentation goes to 4 people my father trusts in 4 different countries. People with standing to act on it, and sufficient independence from Vorn's network that they're not already compromised." She paused. "Vorn will be investigated. His operation will be dismantled, over time. Some of the people named in the brief will face consequences. Others will not, because that is the nature of people with power. Consequences reach them eventually, or never, and there's not always a meaningful difference between those 2 outcomes." She looked at him. "It's not the conclusion you want." "What conclusion do I want?" "The one where everything is resolved and the guilty are punished and the structure is fixed and there's a clear before and after." She looked at the pale blue sky. "That conclusion exists in stories. In reality, you dismantle what you can, you document the rest, and you build something better in the space you've cleared." He was quiet for a moment. "The company," he said, "Vossler Industries, will survive. The fraud is documented and the sources identified and the board departures, while damaging, are recoverable." She paused. You'll need to rebuild the Rotterdam relationships. That will take time. Some of the contacts will distance themselves from the association, at least publicly. She paused again. And you'll need to decide what to do about the 3 contracts that overlap with my father's operations. He looked at her. What do you think I should do about them? She almost said, I think you should terminate them and rebuild the infrastructure independently. That was the clean answer, the operationally sensible answer. Instead, she said, I think you should make that decision with complete information, not under pressure, and in your own time. It's your company. He held her gaze. It survived 8 years partly because of you. It survived 8 years partly because you built something worth surviving, she said. Don't take that from yourself. Whatever else happened, the core of what you built was yours. Something in his face did the thing she'd been watching it do across the last several days. The slow and slightly painful process of a man revising his understanding of his own history. Not erasing it, revising it. Learning to hold the real version alongside the one he'd been carrying, finding the places where they overlapped and the places where they didn't. I want to understand something, he said, and I want you to answer it honestly. I'll try. When you signed the papers, he held her eyes. Were you leaving because of the divorce? Or because you'd already decided to surface and the divorce was both, she said, in equal measure. Both things were true simultaneously. She looked at him. The divorce hurt. I want you to know that. Not because I need you to feel guilty. You've done enough of that. But because I spent a long time telling myself it didn't, and I'm trying to stop doing that. She paused. And I also knew by the morning you handed me those papers that staying was no longer viable. Marcus was moving. The timeline was compressing. I needed to act. She paused. Both things were true. People are allowed to have more than one true thing at once. He nodded slowly. Outside the window, the channel was visible below them. The dark water crossed with the white lines of ships moving in both directions, patient and enormous and unhurried. I don't expect anything, he said. I want you to know that. I didn't come on that deck to buy something. I did it because it was the right thing, and I was too late doing right things for too long. He looked at his hands. Whatever you decide about what comes next, I'm not going to be the person who makes your life smaller again. I understand now what that cost. I'm not going to ask you to pay it again. Elena looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the kitchen counter and the pen. She thought about 4 in the morning and the numbers and the cold tea. She thought about the gallery in Boston and a man who was trying very hard to belong somewhere he didn't, and who had made her laugh twice, genuinely, which she hadn't expected and which had been, for 8 years, a small true thing she'd held on to in the margins of everything else. She thought about what it meant to rebuild something, not restore it. Rebuilding was different from restoring. Restoring meant returning to the original form. Rebuilding meant using what survived and making something different from it. Something that accounted for what the damage had taught you. I'm not going to decide anything today, she said. Okay. Or this month. Okay. But I'm not going to decide nothing, she said. She paused, looking for the right word and finding it after a moment. Pay attention to what's actually there, rather than to what I've decided in advance that I should feel. She looked at him. That's what I'm willing to offer right now. Attention without a predetermined conclusion. He held her gaze. Something in his face settled into something she hadn't seen there before. Not happiness exactly, because the situation was too large and too recently survived for happiness to be the right word, but the specific quiet of a man who has been given a true thing and knows it for what it is. That's more than I deserve, he said. Probably, she said. Don't waste it. 3 months later, the Vorn investigation became public in 2 jurisdictions simultaneously. A coordination that bore, if you knew what you were looking at, the specific signature of information delivered to the right people through channels that left no traceable origin. The coverage was extensive. 2 of the governmental figures named in the brief resigned within the week. The third contested it, vigorously and expensively, and was still contesting it when the new year arrived. Marcus Hale cooperated fully. His testimony was described by the attorneys involved as comprehensive. He did not go to prison. He lost his career, his savings, and the version of himself he'd built on top of a foundation of willful ignorance, and he began the specific long work of living in the aftermath of choices made badly, which is its own kind of sentence and one with no fixed term. Aldrich Vorn was indicted in one jurisdiction and under investigation in two others. His operation did not collapse immediately. Operations with 11 years of infrastructure rarely do. But it was damaged, materially and irreversibly, and the people who had believed themselves safely inside its protection began, quietly, to distance themselves from it, and that distancing accelerated the damage in the way that abandonment always does. Gregor Fast honored the terms of the agreement signed on the deck of the Meridian. Elena had not expected him not to. Fast was many things, but he understood that agreements signed under witness and authenticated biometrically were the kind of agreements that, if violated, made the violator's life structurally untenable in the specific world he operated in. He retired from active operations, which was not the same as disappearing, but was the practical equivalent for the purposes of Elena's calculations. Vossler Industries stabilized. It took the better part of 8 weeks and required the kind of transparent communication with the remaining board that Adrian had not previously been capable of, not because the capability wasn't there, but because the damage from his father's teaching had made transparency feel like exposure rather than strength. He learned the difference, slowly and imperfectly, with assistance from his new general counsel and from a compliance framework that bore, in its underlying architecture, the specific structural intelligence of someone who had spent 8 years watching his company from a vantage point he hadn't known existed. He didn't ask Elena to design it. She hadn't offered. It had arrived in his inbox as a document with no sender information, and he had sat with it for a long time before opening it, and when he did, he had read it through twice, and then he had built it. Cassian Ravel did not retire. The idea would not have occurred to him and would not have been accepted if it had. What he did was bring Elena formally back into the operational structure, not the position she would have inherited if she'd never left, because that position no longer existed in the same form, but something adjacent to it and in some ways more accurate to what she'd actually become in the years of absence. She was not his successor. She was her own thing, informed by his world and her own, and the arrangement they built between them reflected that. They had the conversation about information withheld. It took 3 sessions across 2 weeks, and a great deal of the specific kind of silence that exists between people who communicate primarily by implication and are learning, late, to be more direct with each other. It did not resolve everything. It resolved enough. Dara got a raise, which she accepted without comment, which was how Dara accepted most things. In February, Elena was in a city she was not going to name in this telling, sitting in the window of a small restaurant that served a particular kind of food she'd been missing for years without fully realizing it, when her phone showed a message from Adrian. It contained no words, just a photograph. The photograph was of a cafe table, a specific cafe in Boston, the one they'd gone to after the gallery, the one where they'd talked for 3 hours about a painting neither of them understood and discovered, unexpectedly, that they could make each other think. The table was empty in the photograph. Just a table, 2 chairs, 2 coffee cups. She looked at it for a while. Then she put her phone face down on the table and ate her dinner and watched the street outside the window and let herself be, for the length of one meal, exactly where she was and nothing else. Later, walking back to her hotel through streets that were cold and quiet and lit by the specific amber light of old city lamps, she took her phone out and looked at the photograph again. She thought about attention without a predetermined conclusion. She typed, "Still in the city, I'm not going to tell you about. Back in 2 weeks. Don't redecorate." She sent it and put the phone in her pocket and kept walking. Above her, the February sky was very clear and very dark and full of more stars than the city usually allowed, and she walked under them with her coat pulled close and her hands in her pockets and the cold air sharp in her lungs. And she was Elena Ravel, who had also been Elena Marlowe, who had been invisible and visible and hidden and exposed and lost and found and broken open by the specific blunt instrument of living honestly. And she was going back to her hotel room to sleep, and tomorrow she had work to do, and the work mattered, and she was alive and capable and moving forward through a world that was neither safe nor simple and had never pretended to be either. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.